Haughty CEO dismisses small-town mayor's plea. During re-election, he's shocked to discover who's become a political powerhouse. Hello? Welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy the story. John Whitman, one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, was used to getting his way. His life was built on wealth, arrogance, and the cold certainty that no one could challenge him. But when a small-town mayor named Martha Turner walked into his office, pleading for the survival of her community, John's pride led him to a decision he would never forget. What he didn't know was that this simple act of rejection would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of his life. As the days turned into months, John's world of comfort and control began to unravel in ways he never imagined. And what happens next will leave him and you in utter disbelief. This is a story of power, pride, and redemption, where one man's arrogance becomes his greatest downfall. But it's also about something deeper, the quiet strength of a woman who refused to give up when everything was taken from her. What happens when the tables turn, and those you underestimated become the ones you need most? The gleaming skyscrapers of Manhattan pierced the azure sky, their glass facades reflecting the bustling metropolis below. On the 50th floor of one such tower, John Whitman stood with his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his tailored Italian suit a stark contrast to the desperate figure before him. Martha Turner, the mayor of Crescent Hills, a small rural town in upstate New York, clutched a worn photograph in her trembling hands. Her eyes, brimming with unshed tears, pleaded silently as she spoke, her voice quavering with emotion. "Mr. Whitman, please," Martha implored, her weathered face etched with worry lines. "Our town is dying. The factory closure has left hundreds without jobs. We need your company's investment to survive." John's cold blue eyes swept over Martha's rumpled blazer and scuffed shoes. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth as he adjusted his Rolex watch. "Mrs. Turner," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension, "surely you understand that Whitman Industries can't be bothered with every little backwater burg that comes begging for handouts." Martha flinched as if struck but pressed on. "It's not a handout, sir. We're offering tax incentives, a skilled workforce." "Skilled?" John scoffed, cutting her off. "I doubt anyone in your quaint little town could operate a smartphone, let alone the kind of advanced technology my company deals in." He strode around his massive mahogany desk, towering over the diminutive mayor. "Let me make this perfectly clear," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Your town means nothing to me. It's a speck on the map, not even worth the fuel it would take to fly there." Martha's shoulders sagged, the weight of her town's future crushing down upon her. "But the people," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Families are losing their homes. Children are going hungry." John's laughter, sharp and cruel, cut through the air like a knife. "And that's my problem because—" He leaned in close, his breath hot on Martha's face. "Listen closely, Madam Mayor. Your people's problems are just that. Their problems. Not mine. Not my company's. If they can't hack it in the modern economy, well, that's called natural selection." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks as she gazed at the photo in her hands. A faded image of Crescent Hill's main street, once bustling and vibrant, now a shadow of its former self. "Please," she whispered one last time, "we're not asking for charity. We're asking for a chance." John snatched the photo from her grasp, holding it up to the light. "Charming," he sneered. "Like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Tell me, do you still have a soda fountain at the general store?" He tossed the photo carelessly onto his desk. "Wake up, Mrs. Turner, the world has moved on. Your little slice of Americana is obsolete." Martha's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her body trembling with a mixture of despair and fury. "You won't even consider it?" she asked, her voice hoarse. John's smile was shark-like, all teeth and no warmth. "I've considered it," he said, moving to the door and holding it open. "And my answer is no. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual business to attend to." As Martha shuffled towards the exit, her pride in tatters, John couldn't resist one final barb. "Oh, and Mayor Turner?" he called out, causing her to turn. "Next time you want to waste someone's time, try the Salvation Army. I hear they're more receptive to lost causes." The door slammed shut behind Martha, the sound echoing through the cavernous office like a gunshot. John returned to his desk, already dismissing the encounter from his mind. He had more pressing matters to attend to, like his upcoming re-election campaign for the company's board of directors. Outside in the hallway, Martha leaned against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked down at her empty hands, the absence of the photo, a physical ache in her chest. That picture had been her talisman, a reminder of what she was fighting for. Now, like her hopes for Crescent Hill's future, it was gone. As she made her way to the elevator, Martha's mind whirled with despair. How would she face her constituents? What would she tell the laid-off factory workers, the struggling small business owners, the families teetering on the edge of financial ruin? The elevator doors opened, and Martha stepped inside. Her reflection in the polished metal a stark reminder of how out of place she was in this world of power and privilege. As the car descended, so too did her spirits, plummeting faster than the elevator itself. But then, just as the elevator reached the ground floor, something shifted in Martha's eyes. The despair was still there, yes, but beneath it, a tiny spark ignited. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there, a flicker of determination, of righteous anger. John Whitman had humiliated her, had dismissed her town and its people as if they were less than nothing. But in doing so, he had unwittingly planted a seed of resistance, of defiance against the callous indifference of the powerful. As Martha stepped out onto the busy New York street, jostled by the uncaring crowds, she made a silent vow. This wasn't over. Somehow, someway, she would find a way to save Crescent Hills. And John Whitman? He would rue the day he had so casually crushed her dreams under his expensive Italian leather shoes. Little did either of them know that this encounter, this moment of cruel dismissal and quiet resolve, would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of their worlds. For Martha Turner and John Whitman, life as they knew it was about to change forever. And it all began with a plea, a sneer, and a discarded photograph of a dying small town. Months had passed since Martha Turner's humiliating encounter with John Whitman in his opulent New York office. The seasons had changed, leaves falling and snow blanketing the struggling town of Crescent Hills, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the cold reality facing its residents. In his penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, John Whitman sipped a glass of 30-year-old scotch, barely glancing at the financial news scrolling across his 85-inch television. His re-election campaign for the board was going smoothly, his coffers filled with donations from fellow corporate titans. The plight of some backwater town and its desperate mayor was long forgotten, just another forgettable blip in his world of high-stakes business and power plays. Meanwhile, in Crescent Hills, Martha sat at her kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers and spreadsheets. Her eyes were rimmed with dark circles, evidence of sleepless nights spent trying to find a way, any way, to keep her town afloat. The factory's closure had hit harder than anyone could have imagined. Main Street was a ghost town, with for sale signs outnumbering open businesses. But something had changed in Martha since that day in New York. The spark of defiance that had ignited in the elevator had grown, fueled by the quiet desperation of her neighbors and friends. She couldn't give up. She wouldn't. "Mom," her daughter Sarah called from the doorway. "You need to see this." Martha followed Sarah to the living room where the local news was playing. The reporter's voice was grim as she delivered the latest blow to Crescent Hills. Breaking news. The historic Mill Creek Bridge has partially collapsed due to years of neglect and lack of maintenance funds. County officials warn that a full collapse is imminent. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The Mill Creek Bridge was the town's lifeline, connecting Crescent Hills to the interstate and the outside world. Without it, they were truly isolated. As if on cue, Martha's phone began to ring. It was Tom, the owner of the local hardware store. "Mayor Turner, what are we going to do?" His voice cracked with panic. "That bridge is all we've got left." Martha took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was a disaster, yes, but maybe, just maybe, it could also be an opportunity. "Tom, call everyone. Town meeting in an hour at the high school gym. We're not going down without a fight." An hour later, the gym was packed. The fear in the room was palpable, but as Martha took the stage, she felt a strange calm settle over her. This was her moment. "Friends, neighbors," she began, her voice steady. "I know you're scared, I am too. But we have a choice to make tonight. We can give up, let our town die a slow death, or we can fight." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Martha pressed on, her voice growing stronger. "The Mill Creek Bridge isn't just a structure of steel and concrete. It's a symbol of who we are. Hardworking, resilient, unbreakable. The big corporations and politicians in Albany might have forgotten about us, but we haven't forgotten who we are." She paused, looking out at the sea of familiar faces. "I'm asking you to stand with me, to show the world that Crescent Hills isn't some relic of the past, but a community worth fighting for. Who's with me?" For a moment there was silence. Then from the back of the room, old Mrs. Johnson, who'd lived in Crescent Hills for all of her 87 years, stood up shakily. "I'm with you, Martha," she called out, her voice quavering but determined. It was like a dam breaking. Suddenly people were standing, voices rising in agreement. Tom from the hardware store. Sarah, the high school valedictorian who'd put college on hold to help her family. Jack, the former factory foreman. Martha felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't a time for tears, it was a time for action. "All right, folks," she said, a fierce smile on her face. "Let's get to work." In the days that followed, Crescent Hills became a hive of activity. Farmers lent their equipment to shore up the failing bridge. The high school shop class worked around the clock, fabricating replacement parts. Even the children got involved, organizing bake sales and car washes to raise funds. The story of the little town that refused to die caught the attention of a local news station. Soon, reporters from Albany and even New York City were descending on Crescent Hills, captivated by the tale of small-town grit and determination. As fate would have it, John Whitman caught a glimpse of one such news report while channel surfing in his office. He paused, a frown creasing his brow, as he recognized the determined face of Martha Turner, now grimy with sweat and dirt, directing volunteers at the bridge site. "Isn't that the mayor you told me about?" his assistant asked. "The one from the dying town?" John waved him away, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the screen. Something about Martha's fierce determination nagged at him, a splinter in his mind he couldn't quite dislodge. Little did he know that this was just the beginning. The bridge crisis, as it came to be known, was about to catapult Martha Turner and Crescent Hills into the national spotlight. And John Whitman's carefully ordered world was about to be turned upside down. As the cameras rolled and the nation watched, a small town's fight for survival was becoming something much bigger, a symbol of resilience in the face of corporate indifference, and the first tremors of a seismic shift in the balance of power. The tide was turning, and neither Martha nor John could have predicted where it would take them next. The sun rose over Crescent Hills, its warm light revealing a town transformed. Where once stood dilapidated buildings and empty storefronts, now bustled a community united in purpose. The Mill Creek Bridge, once a symbol of neglect, had become a beacon of hope and resilience. Martha Turner stood at the foot of the newly reinforced bridge, surrounded by a sea of familiar faces. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of activity, each day bringing new challenges and unexpected triumphs. As she gazed at her fellow townspeople, their eyes shining with pride and determination, Martha felt a swell of emotion threaten to overwhelm her. "We did it," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "When the world said we couldn't, we showed them what Crescent Hills is made of." A cheer went up, echoing off the hills that cradled their town. But Martha knew this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, in New York City, John Whitman's world continued to revolve around boardrooms and balance sheets. His re-election campaign was in full swing, his days filled with carefully choreographed photo ops and rehearsed sound bites. "Mr. Whitman," a reporter called out as he left a fundraising luncheon. "Any comment on the situation in Crescent Hills? The town's revival has become quite the story." John's practiced smile never faltered. "I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the specifics," he lied smoothly, "but I'm always pleased to hear of American communities thriving." As his limousine pulled away, John's smile faded. He couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he had severely underestimated Martha Turner and her little town. Back in Crescent Hills, Martha was discovering a newfound strength she never knew she possessed. The bridge crisis had awakened something in her, a fierce determination to fight not just for her town, but for all the forgotten communities across America. Mayor Turner, a young reporter from a national news network, approached her one afternoon. "Your story has captivated the country. What's next for Crescent Hills?" Martha paused, considering her words carefully. "What's next isn't just about Crescent Hills," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about every small town that's been left behind, every community that's been told they don't matter. We're just getting started." The clip went viral, shared millions of times across social media platforms. Suddenly, Martha was being invited to speak at conferences, to share Crescent Hills' story of revival with other struggling towns. As her profile grew, so did the whispers. "Have you heard?" people would say. "Martha Turner's thinking of running for state office." John Whitman, ensconced in his ivory tower, remained oblivious to the groundswell of support building around Martha. His focus was solely on his re-election campaign, on maintaining his grip on power. But the world was changing around him. In diners and union halls, in church basements and community centers, people were talking about Martha Turner, about how she stood up to corporate greed, how she refused to let her town die. One evening, as Martha sat at her kitchen table reviewing invitations to speak at various events, her daughter Sarah burst in, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," she exclaimed, thrusting her phone towards Martha. "You're trending on Twitter." Martha blinked, bewildered. "I'm what?" Sarah laughed, scrolling through the feed. "People are using the hashtag #BeLikeMartha. You're inspiring people all over the country." As the reality of her growing influence sank in, Martha felt a mix of exhilaration and terror. This was so much bigger than she had ever imagined. But with that realization came a sense of responsibility, a duty to use her voice for those who had been silenced for too long. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Martha sat alone in her living room, staring at the faded photograph of Crescent Hills that John Whitman had so callously discarded. She traced the outlines of the familiar buildings, remembering the despair she had felt that day in his office. "You were wrong, Mr. Whitman," she whispered to the empty room. "We're not obsolete, we're not a lost cause, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows it." As Martha's star continued to rise, John Whitman remained cocooned in his world of wealth and privilege. His re-election campaign trudged on, each carefully staged event feeling more hollow than the last. But change was coming, as inexorable as the tide. And soon, very soon, John Whitman would be forced to confront the consequences of his arrogance. For now, though, two worlds continued to spin in parallel, one of growing hope and empowerment, the other of complacency and willful ignorance. But the collision course was set, and when these two forces finally met, the impact would shake the very foundations of power in America. The stage was set for a showdown that would capture the nation's attention and force everyone to question what truly matters in a leader. And at the center of it all stood Martha Turner, the small-town mayor who dared to dream big, and John Whitman, the CEO who was about to learn that true power comes not from wealth but from the people. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of anticipation as John Whitman's sleek private jet touched down at JFK International Airport. His re-election campaign for the board of Whitman Industries was entering its final stretch, and John was riding high on a wave of confidence. Polls showed him comfortably ahead, his corporate allies firmly in his corner. As he strode through the terminal, his phone buzzed with an incoming call from his campaign manager, David. "John, we need to talk." David's voice crackled through the speaker, an edge of urgency in his tone. "Can it wait, David? I've got a press conference in an hour," John replied, irritation creeping into his voice. "No, it can't. Turn on any news channel now." Frowning, John ducked into a nearby airport lounge and grabbed the remote, flipping to a 24-hour news network. His eyes widened as he saw the headlines scrolling across the bottom of the screen. "Small-town Mayor Martha Turner announces bid for governor." The camera cut to a shot of Martha Turner, standing on the steps of the Crescent Hills Town Hall. Gone was the timid, desperate woman who had pleaded in his office months ago. In her place stood a confident, charismatic leader, her voice ringing out clear and strong. For too long, the people of this great state have been ignored by those in power, Martha declared, her eyes blazing with conviction. It's time for a change. It's time for leadership that puts people first, not profits. That's why I'm announcing my candidacy for governor of New York. John felt the blood drain from his face as the crowd erupted in cheers. This couldn't be happening. That insignificant small-town mayor he had dismissed so callously was now a serious contender for one of the most powerful positions in the state. "John, are you there?" David's voice snapped him back to reality. "I'm here," John replied, his voice hoarse. How did we miss this?" David sighed heavily. "We've been so focused on your board re-election we didn't see her coming. She's been building a grassroots movement for months. The Crescent Hills story has resonated with people across the state. Rural communities, working-class neighborhoods in the cities. They're all rallying behind her." John's mind raced, trying to process this seismic shift in the political landscape. "What does this mean for us?" "It means we've got a problem," David said bluntly. "Your company's policies, your public image, they're all going to be under intense scrutiny now. Martha Turner is positioning herself as the anti-you, John. The champion of the little guy against corporate greed." As if on cue, the TV cut back to Martha, who was now taking questions from reporters. "Mayor Turner, what do you say to those who claim you lack the experience to govern a state as large and complex as New York?" a journalist called out. Martha's smile was confident, her response measured. "I say, look at what we've accomplished in Crescent Hills. We faced impossible odds and not only survived but thrived. That's the kind of leadership and innovation our state needs. And let me be clear, I may not have spent years in a corporate boardroom, but I understand what real New Yorkers are going through. Can the same be said for those currently in power?" The pointed jab wasn't lost on John. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back, despite the air-conditioned chill of the lounge. "David," he said, his voice tight with suppressed panic, "cancel the press conference. We need to regroup now." As John hurried out of the airport, his carefully constructed world seemed to be crumbling around him. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely threatened. The dismissive attitude he had shown Martha Turner months ago now came back to haunt him, a ghost of arrogance past. Meanwhile, in Crescent Hills, Martha stood surrounded by her supporters, basking in the glow of possibility. She caught sight of her daughter Sarah in the crowd, tears of pride shining in her eyes. This was more than just a campaign launch. It was the beginning of a movement. As the sun set over New York that evening, two very different scenes played out. In a luxurious Manhattan penthouse, John Whitman paced back and forth, barking orders into his phone, desperately trying to salvage his campaign and his reputation. And in a modest home in Crescent Hills, Martha Turner sat at her kitchen table, poring over policy papers, steeling herself for the fight ahead. The battle lines were drawn. The underdog had become a contender, and the titan of industry found himself on shaky ground. As news of Martha's candidacy spread like wildfire across the state, one thing became clear. The race for governor of New York was about to become the political showdown of the decade, and somewhere in between, the forgotten voices of countless small towns and struggling communities began to rise, sensing that perhaps at last their time had come. The auditorium of the State University of New York at Albany buzzed with anticipation. Camera crews jostled for position, their equipment creating a forest of cables and lights. The air was electric, charged with the kind of tension that precedes moments of historical significance. Tonight was the first gubernatorial debate, and all of New York, indeed much of the nation, was watching. Backstage, John Whitman adjusted his red power tie, his practiced smile masking the turmoil within. The past few weeks had been a nightmare of damage control and hastily revamped campaign strategies. His lead in the polls, once seemingly insurmountable, had evaporated. "Remember?" his campaign manager whispered urgently. "Stick to the talking points. Emphasize your experience, your track record of success. Don't let her bait you into—" "I know what I'm doing," John snapped, his composure slipping for a moment. He took a deep breath, centering himself. He was John Whitman, titan of industry. He wouldn't be rattled by some small-town upstart. In the opposite wing, Martha Turner stood quietly, her eyes closed in silent meditation. Gone was the ill-fitting blazer from that fateful day in John's office. Tonight she wore a crisp navy suit, exuding an aura of quiet confidence. Sarah, now her mother's unofficial campaign manager, squeezed Martha's hand. "You've got this, Mom," she said softly. "Just be yourself. That's what got you here." Martha opened her eyes, smiling at her daughter. "Thank you, sweetheart, for everything." The moderator's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your candidates for governor of New York." As John and Martha walked onto the stage, the contrast between them couldn't have been starker. John moved with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to the spotlight, his smile dazzling but somehow cold. Martha's steps were purposeful, her expression one of determination and warmth. They shook hands briefly, John's grip a touch too firm, Martha's gaze unwavering. As they took their positions behind the podiums, the battle was joined. The first half of the debate proceeded along expected lines. John touted his business acumen, promising to run the state like a successful corporation. Martha emphasized her grassroots approach, speaking passionately about revitalizing forgotten communities. But then came the moment that would be replayed on news channels for weeks to come. "Mr. Whitman," the moderator began, "a question about your approach to rural economic development. Critics have accused you of being out of touch with the needs of small-town America. How do you respond?" John's smile never faltered. "I reject that characterization entirely. My company has created thousands of jobs across this state. We understand what it takes to drive economic growth in all communities." "If I may," Martha interjected, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Whitman, do you remember a meeting we had in your office about 8 months ago?" John's smile froze, a flicker of recognition and fear passing through his eyes. "I'm afraid I don't recall the specific meeting you're referring to, Mrs. Turner. I meet with many people." Martha nodded as if expecting this response. "Allow me to refresh your memory. I came to your office begging for help to save my town after your company's actions led to the closure of our main factory. Do you remember what you told me?" The audience held its collective breath. John's throat worked convulsively, but no words came out. Martha continued, her voice gaining strength. "You said, and I quote, 'Your town means nothing to me. It's a speck on the map, not even worth the fuel it would take to fly there.' You called us obsolete, Mr. Whitman. You dismissed the lives and livelihoods of thousands of New Yorkers as, and again I quote, 'a lost cause.'" A gasp rippled through the audience. John's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time. That's not... You're taking my words out of context," he stammered. But the damage was done. Martha turned to face the audience, her eyes shining with emotion. "This is the choice before us, New York. Do we want leadership that sees our communities as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet? Or do we want a government that recognizes the inherent worth and potential of every town, every neighborhood, every citizen of this great state?" The applause was deafening. John Whitman stood frozen, the full weight of his past arrogance crashing down upon him. In that moment he realized that he had not just lost a debate, he had lost touch with the very people he aspired to lead. As the debate concluded and the candidates left the stage, the contrast was even more pronounced than at the beginning. John moved like a man in shock, his confident stride replaced by uncertain steps. Martha, on the other hand, walked tall, buoyed by the knowledge that she had not just held her own, she had changed the entire conversation. Outside the auditorium, supporters from both camps mingled, their conversations animated. But there was a palpable shift in the air, a sense that something fundamental had changed in the race for governor. In the coming days, political pundits would dissect every moment of the debate, but they all agreed on one thing. The confrontation between Martha Turner and John Whitman had been a turning point. The image of the small-town mayor standing up to the corporate titan had struck a chord with voters across the state. As Martha hugged Sarah tightly backstage, tears of relief and joy streaming down both their faces, she knew that this was more than just a personal victory. It was a vindication of every small town, every struggling community that had ever been dismissed or forgotten. The race was far from over, but in that auditorium in Albany a seismic shift had occurred. The voice of the people, long ignored by the powerful, had finally been heard. And it was loud, clear, and demanding change. The New York City skyline glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of John Whitman's penthouse apartment, but he saw none of it. Slumped in his leather armchair, tie loosened and jacket discarded, John stared unseeing at the tumbler of scotch in his hand. The ice had long since melted, diluting the expensive liquor, much like how the events of the past few weeks had diluted his once unshakable confidence. The debate had been a disaster. Worse, it had been a public humiliation, broadcast live to millions. John's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with calls from board members, investors, and political allies, all demanding explanations, all barely concealing their disappointment and anger. For the first time in decades, John Whitman felt truly alone. As the city pulsed with life far below, John's mind wandered back to his childhood in the Bronx. He remembered the cramped apartment, the constant worry about money, the determination to never be poor again. When had that drive for success turned into something colder, harder? He thought of his father, a factory worker who had lost his job when John was just a teenager. The memory of his dad's defeated slouch, the quiet desperation in his eyes as he searched for work, it hit John like a physical blow. When had he become the very thing his younger self had despised? Across the state, in the modest home that had become the unofficial headquarters of her surging campaign, Martha Turner sat at her kitchen table. Campaign posters and policy briefings were strewn about, but her attention was focused on a small framed photograph. It showed Crescent Hills as it had been years ago, Main Street bustling with life, the old mill chimney puffing smoke in the background. Martha traced the familiar outlines with her finger, her heart aching for what had been lost and what might yet be regained. Sarah entered the kitchen, a steaming mug of tea in each hand. "Mom, you okay?" Martha looked up, offering a tired smile. "Just thinking, sweetheart, about everything that's happened, everything that's at stake." Sarah sat down, sliding one mug across the table. "You were amazing at the debate, Mom. You showed everyone who John Whitman really is." Martha's brow furrowed. "That's what I've been thinking about, actually. I went into that debate wanting to expose John's callousness, his disregard for people like us. And I did. But what?" Sarah prompted gently. Martha sighed. "But I saw something in his eyes when I confronted him. It wasn't just shock or anger, it was pain, like I'd forced him to see a part of himself he'd been avoiding for a long time." Back in his penthouse, John found himself drawn to his home office. It was a space he rarely used, preferring the grandeur of his corporate headquarters. But tonight, something pulled him there. He flicked on the light, illuminating shelves lined with awards and accolades. Businessman of the Year, Corporate Innovator, Philanthropist of the Decade. Once, these titles had filled him with pride. Now they felt hollow, meaningless. His gaze fell on a small, dusty frame tucked away in a corner. With trembling hands, he picked it up, wiping away years of neglect. It was a newspaper clipping from his hometown, celebrating his first major business success. The headline read, "Local boy makes good, Whitman gives back to community." John stared at his younger self in the photo, standing proudly in front of the youth center he had funded. When had that idealistic young man, eager to use his success to help others, transformed into the cold, dismissive figure Martha Turner had confronted on that debate stage? As dawn broke over New York, two very different scenes played out. In a luxurious Manhattan penthouse, John Whitman finally fell into a troubled sleep, his dreams haunted by faces of those he had dismissed and forgotten. And in a small-town kitchen, Martha Turner and her daughter shared a quiet moment of reflection, grappling with the weight of the movement they had started and the changes it might bring. The gubernatorial race had become more than just a political contest. It had become a battle for the soul of New York, and perhaps for the souls of its candidates. As both John and Martha faced their own doubts and reflections, the stage was set for a dramatic shift that would surprise them both. The coming days would test not just their political skills, but their capacity for growth, empathy, and redemption. And as the sun rose on a new day, neither could have predicted the extraordinary turns their journey was about to take. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of change as Martha Turner stepped onto the podium at a campaign rally in Buffalo. The crowd, a sea of faces both young and old, urban and rural, erupted in cheers. Martha's message of hope and renewal had struck a chord across the state, propelling her from small-town mayor to the frontrunner in the gubernatorial race. But as she looked out at the expectant faces, Martha felt a weight on her shoulders heavier than any she had carried before. In her hand, she clutched a manila envelope, its contents burning a hole in her conscience. Just hours earlier, an anonymous source had delivered a bombshell, irrefutable evidence that John Whitman's company had not only contributed to Crescent Hill's economic decline, but had actively worked to suppress information about environmental damages caused by their former factory. The revelation had hit Martha like a thunderbolt. This was it, the silver bullet that could not only win her the election, but utterly destroy John Whitman's career and legacy. It was everything her campaign team had dreamed of. And yet, as Martha began her speech, her mind raced. The words came automatically, practiced phrases about unity and progress. But her thoughts were elsewhere. She thought of the pain in John's eyes during the debate, the glimpse of a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. Across the state, in a small diner on the outskirts of Albany, John Whitman sat alone in a booth, nursing a cup of black coffee. He was a far cry from the polished CEO who had once sneered at Martha Turner in his office. His suit was rumpled, his eyes lined with exhaustion. The bell above the door jingled, and John looked up to see David, his campaign manager, sliding into the booth across from him. "John," David began, his voice low and urgent, "we need to talk strategy. The polls are—" "It's over, David," John interrupted, his voice hollow. "We both know it." David leaned forward, frustration evident in his face. "It's not over until the votes are counted. We can still spin this. We can—" "Spin what?" John snapped, a flicker of his old fire returning. "Spin the fact that I've spent my career putting profits over people? That I've become everything I once despised?" David fell silent, taken aback by the raw emotion in John's voice. John continued, softer now. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, David, about who I was, who I've become, and I don't like what I see." Back in Buffalo, Martha was nearing the climax of her speech. The crowd was with her, hanging on her every word. This was the moment, the perfect time to reveal the damning evidence against John Whitman and cement her path to victory. But as she reached for the envelope, Martha hesitated. In that split second, a memory flashed through her mind, of her father, a man of unwavering integrity, telling her, "Power doesn't corrupt, Martha. It reveals. It shows who you truly are." With a deep breath, Martha made her decision. "My fellow New Yorkers," she said, her voice strong and clear, "this campaign has been about more than just winning an election. It's been about rediscovering the values that make our state great: compassion, resilience, and the belief that every person, every community, has value." The crowd nodded in agreement, but a ripple of confusion began to spread as Martha continued. "It's easy to vilify those who have wronged us, to seek revenge rather than understanding. But true leadership means rising above personal grievances for the greater good." Martha locked eyes with Sarah in the front row, seeing a mix of surprise and pride in her daughter's face. "That's why I'm calling for a new approach, not just in how we govern, but in how we treat each other, even those we see as opponents." In the Albany diner, John's phone buzzed with a news alert. His eyes widened as he read the headline. "Turner calls for reconciliation, proposes bipartisan approach to corporate accountability." John looked up at David, confusion etched on his face. "She had the perfect opportunity to bury me. Why didn't she take it?" David shrugged, equally baffled. Maybe she's playing a longer game than we thought." As Martha concluded her speech to thunderous applause and John sat contemplating this unexpected turn of events, the political landscape of New York shifted once again. But this time, the change wasn't just in poll numbers or campaign strategies. It was a change in the very fabric of the conversation, a reminder that even in the cutthroat world of politics, there was still room for compassion, growth, and the possibility of redemption. As night fell across the Empire State, both Martha Turner and John Whitman found themselves at a crossroads. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time in months, it held the promise of something more than just victory or defeat. It held the possibility of transformation, not just for them, but for the entire state they both, in their own ways, sought to serve. The air crackled with anticipation as election night descended upon New York. In campaign headquarters across the state, volunteers huddled around television screens, their faces a mixture of hope and anxiety. The polls had been neck and neck in the final days, and now, as the results began to trickle in, the entire state held its collective breath. At the heart of New York City, in a lavishly decorated ballroom, John Whitman stood alone by a window, watching the city lights flicker below. The room behind him buzzed with activity, campaign staff, supporters, and media personalities all awaiting his appearance, but John remained apart, lost in thought. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of soul-searching and difficult conversations. Martha Turner's unexpected act of restraint had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront the man he had become. The journey hadn't been easy, but for the first time in years, John felt a glimmer of something he'd long forgotten: hope. Meanwhile, in the gymnasium of Crescent Hills High School, Martha Turner was surrounded by a sea of familiar faces. Friends, neighbors, and supporters who had been with her from the beginning packed the room, their excitement palpable. Sarah stood by her mother's side, clutching her hand tightly. As the night wore on, the race remained too close to call. The tension in both camps was reaching a fever pitch when suddenly, a hush fell over the crowds. The networks were ready to make their projection. "Ladies and gentlemen," the anchor's voice rang out, "we can now project that the next governor of New York will be Martha Turner." The gymnasium erupted in cheers, a tidal wave of joy and disbelief washing over the crowd. Martha stood stunned for a moment, tears welling in her eyes as the reality of the moment sank in. She hugged Sarah fiercely, both of them overcome with emotion. Back in New York City, a different scene unfolded. John Whitman stepped up to the podium, the room falling silent as he prepared to give his concession speech. But as he looked out at the expectant faces, John realized that this moment called for something more than just a gracious admission of defeat. "My fellow New Yorkers," he began, his voice steady. "First, I want to congratulate Governor-elect Martha Turner on her victory. But I also want to say something that's long overdue." John paused, taking a deep breath. "I was wrong. For too long, I've put profit over people, arrogance over empathy. I dismissed the concerns of communities like Crescent Hills, believing that their struggles were not my problem. But Martha Turner showed all of us what true leadership looks like." "True?" A murmur rippled through the crowd as John continued. "It's not about winning at all costs. It's about lifting each other up, about recognizing the inherent worth in every community, every individual. Martha Turner didn't just win an election tonight. She reminded us of who we can be at our best." As John's words were broadcast across the state, Martha watched in astonishment from Crescent Hills. The gymnasium had fallen silent, all eyes glued to the screens. "And so," John concluded, "while I may not be your next governor, I pledge to work alongside Governor-elect Turner to make New York a state where no community is left behind, where every voice is heard. Because that's the New York we all deserve." The applause in the ballroom was tentative at first, then grew to a roar. It was a moment of genuine bipartisan unity, a rare thing in these divided times. As the night wore on, Martha prepared to give her victory speech. But first, she had one important call to make. With trembling fingers, she dialed a number she never thought she'd use. "Mr. Whitman, this is Martha Turner." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Governor-elect Turner," John replied, his voice warm. "Congratulations on your victory." "Thank you, John," Martha said, the formality between them dissolving. I heard your speech. It was unexpected, but deeply appreciated." John chuckled softly. "Well, you taught me a valuable lesson about the power of unexpected gestures. I have a lot to make up for, Martha. A lot of communities to make amends to." "That's actually why I'm calling," Martha said, her heart racing. "I'd like to meet with you next week to discuss how we can work together to revitalize the communities that have been left behind. Your business expertise combined with our grassroots approach, I think we could do a lot of good." There was a moment of silence and Martha feared she had overstepped. But then John's voice came through, thick with emotion. "I'd be honored, Governor-elect Turner. Truly honored." As Martha hung up the phone, she felt a sense of possibility washing over her. She looked out at the crowd gathered in the gymnasium, her friends, her neighbors, the people who had believed in her from the start. They were no longer just the citizens of a struggling small town. They were the vanguard of a movement, a testament to what could be accomplished when people came together. Martha stepped up to the podium, her heart full. As she began her speech, she knew that this wasn't just a victory for her or for Crescent Hills. It was a victory for every forgotten community, every dismissed voice. It was the dawn of a new era in New York politics. And as her words rang out, echoing across the state, Martha Turner and John Whitman, once bitter opponents, stood as living proof that redemption was possible, that bridges could be built across the deepest divides. The road ahead would not be easy, but on this night, in this moment, hope burned bright across the Empire State. A new chapter was beginning, not just for New York, but for the very idea of what leadership could be.
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.